Hello and welcome, dear students. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is Locke's theory of property, justification and critique. The main objectives of this lecture are to explore the role of property in political theory, to analyze John Locke's philosophy of property and labor's role, to discuss limitations on private property based on Locke's natural law, to explore John Locke's justification of his theory of property, and lastly, to evaluate Locke's views on unequal property, charity, and the public good. Property, a concept that transcends mere ownership and material possessions, has held a central place in political theory and public discourses for centuries. It has, in many ways, become emblematic of the ideological divide that characterizes political thought. The great debate in political theory, spanning over 2 centuries between capitalism and socialism, often boils down to a fundamental question about property. Specifically, it hinges on whether property should be in the hands of the individuals, freely utilized for personal gain and pleasure, or whether it should be collectively owned and managed for the public good. In essence, this debate typifies property into 3 broad categories: private, common, and state-owned. The defining characteristic of private property is that it bestows upon its holder the right to exclude others from it, while common property lacks this exclusivity. Proponents of private property argue that it serves a powerful incentive for labor, driving individuals to work and invest in their property to reap the benefits. Private property promotes essential political virtues, primarily liberty, as it safeguards individuals' right against encroachment. Any intrusion upon private property rights is seen to contain the seeds of totalitarian oppression, emphasizing the vital link between personal property and liberty. Furthermore, private ownership holders have a vested interest in the progress of prosperity of society, given that their personal success is closely tied to the well-being of the community as a whole. Lastly, private property can be a source of personal fulfillment, fostering a sense of ownership and responsibility for one's assets. Conversely, critics of private property argue that it poses a significant threat to liberty, primarily due to the potential for gross inequality that it fosters. The famous statement by Perry Joseph Proudhon, "Property is theft," encapsulates this perspective. The accumulation of private property can lead to extreme disparities in wealth, which can translate into significant power imbalances, ultimately curtailing the freedoms of the less privileged. Moreover, the opponents contend that private ownership model distorts human nature through the encouragement of greed and excessive materialism, depleting natural resources and causing ecological harm. This perspective aligns with the concept of ecological stewardship in green politics, which emphasizes the need for collective responsibility in managing environmental resources. Those against private property also argue for redistribution of wealth and resources to serve the common good, emphasizing that the wealth generated should be used to address societal needs and inequalities. The dichotomy between private and common property echoes a broader ideological divide in political theory. Politics has at times been oversimplified into a choice between market and the plan. This simplification underscores the depth of the property debate's influence on political thought, as it often frames the broader discussions about the role of government, individual rights, and societal welfare. One of the most popular, influential, and for some notorious takes on private property comes from John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, as deduced from his several writings, including an essay on human understanding written in 1689 and widely read 2 treatises on civil government written in 1689. We try to explicate the intricacies of his opinions on private property in the following part of this lecture. Let's discuss Lockean concept of property. Broadly speaking, property implies something that is one's own. That is, as Locke says, anything over which nobody has right to but himself. Lives, liberties, and estates I call by the general name property, Locke argues. Further, Peter Laslett opines, except in the chapter on private property and in other cases where it is clear that material possessions are meant, the word property in the second treatise is meant to be read in this context. Locke postulated that in the state of nature, individuals coexisted in a condition of unequal freedom, with their powers relatively balanced. In this state, universal freedom and equality reigned, which for Locke was original communism. This concept of original communism implied collective ownership over everything, a scenario where no single individual held exclusive property rights. Interestingly, Locke's contemporary, Robert Filmer, at whom the first treatise was directed, while holding similar views regarding the notion of original communism, failed to convince Locke on the question of societal transition from common ownership to private property. Filmer contended that transition would require the consent of every person in the world for any act of the property acquisition, essentially requiring a near impossible global consensus. This view placed the onus of property acquisition on the need of unanimous consent. Locke, on the other hand, offers a very novel perspective on the matter. He asserted that the key to transitioning from original communism to private property was the relationship between an individual and the labor. Locke's famous words, "Man has a property in his own person," underscored this idea that individuals inherently owned the labor of their bodies and fruits of their hands' work. According to Locke, when individuals mix their labor with a resource or property, it becomes their rightful possession. This effectively eliminated the need for the consent of all requirement, and it laid the groundwork for what we now know as the labor theory of property. According to this theory, the origin of property rights is rooted in labor and individual effort rather than requiring universal consensus. Locke's innovative approach thus fundamentally altered the way we think about transition from original communism to private property, shifting the focus from global agreement to the connection between an individual's labor and property rights. This concept of labor mixing with resources continues to be the cornerstone of modern property theory, reshaping the very foundation of property rights and individual ownership in political philosophy. It effectively negated all the other prevalent theories of property which deserve a mention here. One of such is force theory of property. The notion that every man not only may but must snatch from another by any and every means which the other in his turn is obliged to keep safe. There's another one, occupancy theory of property. The idea is that the land belongs not only to someone who sits on it, but also one who labors on it and produces goods from it, whatever they might be. Still one more, need or utility theory of property. A thing isn't one's property just because it is of some use to them. Such then is the basic premise of Lockean property. One makes something his property when his labor hath taken it out of the hands of nature, where it was common and belonged equally to all her children, and hath thereby appropriated it to himself. Locke, however, placed several limitations on the acquisition of private property. These limitations, rooted in the concept of natural law, were designed to temper the potentially unrestricted accumulation of property. three fundamental natural law limitations were proposed by Locke: the sufficiency limitation, the spoilage limitation, and labor limitation. Let's discuss each of them. The sufficiency limitation. It dictates that acquisition of private property should not occur in a way that leaves others without enough and as good property as for their own needs. In essence, individuals should only appropriate property to the extent that it does not deprive others of the opportunity to acquire property of a similar value and utility. The second one is the spoilage limitation. It specifies that property should be acquired only to the extent that it can be put to advantageous use before it spoils or goes to waste. This principle encourages responsible and efficient use of resources, preventing unnecessary hoarding or wastage. The last one, the labor limitation. A critical component of Locke's philosophy asserts that individuals can rightfully appropriate property only through their own labor. For example, if an individual works on a piece of land, the labor should ideally produce ownership rights over that land. This principle is deeply ingrained in Locke's theory, emphasizing the connection between personal labor and property ownership. However, as Locke himself acknowledged, all these limitations underwent a significant transformation with the introduction of money. This element, money, fundamentally altered the intrinsic value of things, rendering the sufficiency, spoilage, and labor limitations less applicable. Money became a means of exchange, representing value and facilitating transactions, which transcended the inherent limitations tied to the direct use of resources. Locke recognized that money's creation and usage were governed by tacit and voluntary consent. Unlike perishable goods, money does not spoil, eliminating the concerns related to the resources going to waste. Additionally, under the monetary system, labor could be exchanged for wages, and the fruits of labor, such as cultivating land, accrued to the owner of the labor, often the master or the employer. The consequences of this transformation are theoretically profound. Private property ownership becomes more fluid and less restricted by the original limitations. This shift inevitably leads to disparities in private ownership among individuals, a change that some critics view as Locke's tacit endorsement of the burgeoning capitalist class and their unrestricted property acquisition. Various critics have raised their voices against Locke's stance on property limitations. For example, Ebenstein states, in Locke's doctrine of property, he makes no serious attempt to reconcile the teaching of natural law, which seems to result in reasonable equality of property, with the inequality of property, which stems by consent among men from the use of money. Similarly, Pollock says that Locke saw the difficulty but did not remove it. With unruffled composure, he went on his way as if nothing had happened. Similarly, according to Leo Strauss, the introduction of money leads to emancipation of acquisitiveness. And finally, one of the bitter critics of Locke was C.B. Macpherson. Macpherson opines, Locke's astonishing achievement was to base the property on natural right and then remove all the natural law limitations from the property right. Locke's limitations on the acquisition of private property rooted in natural law were fundamentally altered by the introduction of money. This transformation had far-reaching consequences, leading to disparities in property ownership and sparking criticism from various scholars who saw a disconnection between Locke's natural law principles and realities of a monetary system. Locke's contribution to the philosophy of property continued to spark debate and reflection on the role of property in society. The basic critique of Locke's theory, thus, is that it uses natural law and rights accruing therefrom to justify the creation of tacit agreement among individuals for a disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth. However, Locke has a totally different justification for it. Now let's discuss the necessity to protect different human faculties as comes in his writings. In Locke, we find a division of humanity in two distinct categories, the industrious and the rational, and the quarrelsome and contentious. Locke's philosophy delves into an inherent differences in human behavior and work ethic, leading to divergent levels of human exertion in the pursuit of creating property. This divergence, according to Locke, naturally results in varying degrees of property ownership and wealth accumulation among individuals. Locke's categorization of people into these two categories is pivotal to his theory of property. He asserts that the former group, the industrious and the rational individuals, are characterized by their diligence, rationality, and a strong work ethic. They are more inclined to expend substantial labor towards the acquisition and improvement of property. In contrast, the latter group, the quarrelsome and the contentious individuals, exhibit traits that lead to less productive labor, often due to their proclivity for conflict and contention. These inherent differences in labor expenditure set the stage for unequal property ownership. The logical corollary of this differentiation in faculties is that it yields unequal amounts of labor and consequently varying levels of property ownership. Locke's philosophical perspective is further enriched by his assertion that the ultimate goal of humanity is to create a world characterized by abundance. He envisions a world where resources are efficiently utilized for the benefit and prosperity of all. It is within this context that Locke emphasizes the role of monetary exchanges in transitioning from the state of nature that is unassisted to a state of nature that is actively shaped by human intervention. Locke attaches great significance to this transformation, regarding it as compulsory and intentional shift rather than a random occurrence. This transformation is a deliberate act that alters the fundamental dynamics of property acquisition and exchange, paving the way for a more advanced, prosperous society. For Locke, this division is in line with the divine ordainment of humans to labor and bear fruit. The distinction between these two groups, based on their work ethic and productive capacities, mirrors the natural order. It is also important to recognize the fact that there was no restriction in Locke as to who could and could not acquire property. For Locke, property is merely not a right, it is an obligation. Both God and reason command man to labor. Locke therefore rejects the theory of leisure class. In Locke's words, even those who are left by their predecessors with a plentiful fortune are, by law of God, under an obligation of doing something. Furthermore, Locke advances the argument that inequalities in property rights resulting from varying levels of labor and productivity ultimately benefits even the propertyless individuals. The unequal possessions of the propertied class act as a channel to facilitate the productivity of the overall system, giving in turn the landless a better standard of life than they would in a utopian world of equally distributed material possessions. Locke provides an illustration by referring to the inhabitants of the Aboriginal America. He notes that despite their vast tracts of land, they were rich in land and poor in all comforts of life. As Locke opined, the Native Americans have not 1/100th part of the conveniences we enjoy, and a king of a large and fruitful territory there feeds, lodges, and is clad worse than a day laborer in England. Even if this overall welfare and good consequences of Lockean property distribution did not come to fruition, Locke expected that it would be remedied by the rich being made accountable for the obligation of private charity. Now let's talk about this charity argument. As John Moulds writes, certainly a man does have to think of needs of others. Charity is one of the obligations of Lockean natural law. Locke firmly held that desperate poverty always has a thumping right over property. In other words, others' property must never be the cause for others' starvation. Locke wrote in the first treatise, "Charity gives every man a title to so much out of another's plenty as will keep him from extreme want, where he has no means to subsist otherwise." While it is stated by several commentators that it is an out-of-place statement in the first treatise, Locke's doctrine has but no other implication than public good being sufficiently important. Nevertheless, such a doctrine will always have room for being used to justify the unjust and unequal acquisition of assets and material possessions by the heavily propertied over the less fortunate deprived groups of people. Some of it has to do with Locke's personal life and his politics. Now let's talk about Locke as a person. Locke's philosophical perspective on property and wealth indeed possesses aspects reflecting favoritism towards expansionist property acquisition, but it has to always be read into with his consistent thread of commitment to the promotion of public good. Locke's assertion that riches do not consist in having more gold and silver, but in having more in proportion than the rest of the world, reveals his inclination towards a form of economic thinking aligned with mercantilism. He emphasizes the idea that a state's wealth is not solely contingent on the accumulation of gold and silver, but more significantly on the relative proportion of wealth it possesses compared to other states. Locke's perspective reflects a belief in the competitive nature of states in the global arena, where the accumulation of wealth and resources is seen as a means of ensuring a state's prosperity and power. This outlook can be interpreted as a favoring of expansionist property acquisition driven by the pursuit of a greater share of world's resources. Moreover, Locke's support for expansionist property acquisition is often linked to his role in the government of Lord Somers and his involvement in the Board of Trade. Locke played a significant part in the establishment of this board, which was instrumental in furthering the interests of the British Empire, particularly in the Americas. Locke's practical activities and influence in this regard demonstrates his commitment to facilitating and promoting expansion of British interests and property acquisition, aligning with his Baconian concern for exploration and territorial expansion. However, it is important to note that Locke's support for expansionist property acquisition coexists with his emphasis on the public good. In Locke's words, private men's interests ought not to be neglected nor sacrificed to anything but the manifest advantage of the public. In other words, while he acknowledges the competitive nature of the states and their quest for wealth, he also underscores the importance of balancing individual interests with the broader welfare of society. Additionally, Locke's stance on interest rates provides further insight into his dual perspective. Locke suggests that a legal reduction of the interest rate to 4% would unfairly penalize widows and orphans, since it would impoverish a great innocent part of the people who, having their estates in money, have as much right to make as much of their money as it's worth. Locke's advocacy for the public good reveals a deeper commitment towards creating an equitable society that benefits all its members, and he might not, after all, be the expansionist harbinger of evil of consumerist capitalism in the world that he is made out to be. Now let's conclude the lecture. John Locke's doctrine of property can be viewed as a dual portrait. On the one hand, it indicates his favoritism towards unbridled property acquisition driven by competitive wealth accumulation, especially through his practical involvement in government. On the other hand, it underscores his commitment to the public welfare, ensuring that the apparent inequality is for the collective good. This dual perspective reflects the complexity of Locke's political and economic thought, balancing the pursuit of wealth with concern for societal welfare that might appear inadequate to some. With this, we have come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. Thank you for watching.